Okay, good morning. I'm coming on live here. We're waiting for all my streams to click in and we'll jump right into it. We're continuing a conversation about our relationship with money. Last week, we finished off a conversation about how we can shift from scarcity to abundance, some specific hands on, very Newtonian, very much real, tactical, tangible actions we can take in order to be able to shift our relationship with money from scarcity to abundance. But here in the fifth month of May, as we are continuing to look at our fifth domain, our domain of money, I think it's time to start talking about how our relationship with money has evolved. Our relationship with money is a really old relationship. It's gone on for years, for decades. And so I think it's really important to start looking at where did it start, because that's where we got our first relationship with it. So when we think about it, it was interesting to sit in a large circle of men last Wednesday night and hear about where their relationship with money started. And most of the men kind of had their relationship starting around 12 years old, some when they were teenagers, some when they were 8 or 9, and it had to do with a range of experiences. Some men talked about being able to asking for money because they wanted to buy something. They wanted a donut, and so they went to their mother and said, can I have 50 cents to buy a donut? And so it was a relationship of dependence, but it was also a relationship of power where once they had the money, they could obtain this thing with it, but it was coming from a dependent source. Some men, it was very magical. It was their question was how did this money transform into the donut? How does that happen? And for some men, it was about independence, and it was about developing their own relationship. Like they discovered that if they started mowing lawns in their neighborhood, they could become little entrepreneurs and create more money for themselves, and that would allow them to then go out and buy more things or save more money in a coffee can in their cabinet. And that if they were able to, like one man said, I think he was mowing the lawn of everybody on his block, and so he had kind of cornered the market, and that gave him a tremendous sense of power in his relationship with money. And so I think it's really important that we look at it and talk about where our relationship started. I had a very powerful experience, and so let me go back. And then what happened was we talked about, when did your relationship change? What was the next event that happened? So one man went from sort of having this dependent relationship where money, had to come from his parents to, well, his next big stop in his relationship was really when he said he was a young man, he'd finished college, and he was able to have his first job, and he was fully self-sufficient and able to live the life that he wanted to live with the money that he was earning. And so that became a relationship of self-sufficiency and a relationship of that sort of empowerment where he was in charge. And I want to say, when I think about my relationship with money, it really came from my parents, and I had some, there were some very critical experiences. Like I remember when my dad would balance his checkbook, it was literally like he was going to solve world peace. He would take over the dining room table, and out would come all of these records, checkbook, those little checkbook. I don't know if you keep a manual checkbook, the bank gives you this. I don't know if people use this anymore electronically, because I don't. I keep all my checking records online now. But a little manual check register where you write in every check and where it went to and how much it was for, and you track your balance. And he would just have months of these checkbook registers, and he would have piles of checks and mountains of, it just seemed like stacks of papers that he'd have to go through, and balancing the checkbook became like an all-night affair. And I don't know if that was the night he was doing his taxes. It was very mysterious, and it was very difficult, challenging, and onerous. I remember his attitude was like, he was going through the ringer. That was a more adult, but that was still an elementary school vision of what money meant, that it was very hard to manage, and it was kind of a beast that took you over, and you had to have this big apparatus to deal with it. An early memory is asking my dad for allowance. I think I had like a 50-cent allowance, and Sunday was supposed to be allowance day, and I'd ask my dad, can I have my allowance? And he said, oh, I don't have it right now. And I, as an 8-year-old or a 6-year-old, I'd be like, oh, okay, well, when will you have it? And then weeks would go by, and he, all of a sudden he'd pay me $3 for 6 weeks of allowance. That was a relationship with money of not just dependence, but lack of control, lack of planning. It was a non-relationship. What transformed me, and it took me a long time, was when I sat down and I thought to myself, holy crap, my dad didn't have 50 cents in his pocket. He didn't have 2 quarters that he could have just handed me my allowance. Because when you're 8 years old, 50 cents seems like a tremendous amount of money. You don't know the difference between 50 cents and $1 million. So it's like, oh, okay, wow, it must be a lot of money if dad doesn't have it right now. Well, once I started, was able to sort of look back on it with a little more sobriety than was in the situation at the time, I was like, WTF, that was 50 cents. So once I was able to see that incongruity, see that lack of logic or rationality or sobriety, in maybe the simplest term, the lack of ownership, that he didn't think to himself, okay, it's Sunday, I need to make sure I have 50 cents to give Mark. And I think my sisters were a lot younger than me. Maybe they got a quarter, and maybe my youngest sister, who may have been at that time 4 years old, got a dime. He didn't have 85 cents to give to his kids. He didn't plan ahead for it. It just showed how little consciousness he had about money. And when I realized that, it was incredibly powerful, because that was the first step for me to being able to transform my relationship with money. It was my first step to being able to cut the cord and say, I don't have to live the relationship with money that was given to me from my parents, or at least from my father, right? That was what I was focusing on there. That's why I think it's so important for us to dig back and look at our relationship with money is very old, and what were the first images that we had with it. And then what was the second model or template or framework that we had for dealing with money? How did that change? Because once we see that shift, we're doing a really important thing, as I did with understanding really how pathetic it was that my dad had not planned and dealt with money for allowance for his kids in any rational way. It was now I had an opportunity to shift it and say, I don't want to be in that relationship. I want to be owned. I want to be in control. I want to be in charge of that relationship. So that's how we can shift it. The next question is, now that we are starting to understand where it came from, we need to ask ourselves, is it time to change our relationship with money? Did we have that transformative moment where we said, wait a minute, I don't want to live in that house that I grew up in, the money house. I get this image in my mind about fiddler crabs. Fiddler crabs are these, they're these crabs that don't have a shell of their own. They find a shell and take it on. And so there can be any kind of shells that they live in, different shapes, different sizes, but they'll take it on. They don't build their own shell. We are growing up like fiddler crabs, living in the shell of the home that we grew up in. So whatever the relationship with money was that it existed in our family, that's what we're wearing. And so now we have an opportunity to say, wait a minute, that's their shell. What's my shell? What do I want my shell to be? And do I want my shell to be a shell of ownership? Do I want my shell to be a shell of sobriety and responsibility? And if so, what do I need to do to get there? Now, one critical thing happens when we ask ourselves that question, is to be aware of what resistance we're getting when we ask it. Just asking the question, by the way, means that we're overcoming a certain amount of resistance. Pay attention to that. Because how much resistance do we have to how much resistance do most of us have to not even ask that question? To just continue to go along, blinders down, unconscious, not aware of what the relationship with money was that we grew up with, and just continue to perpetuate it. That's certainly the safest. That's the easiest. And I want to be clear, this is not about how much money you have. I think there are people who have millions upon millions of dollars, and they're still living with the relationship of money that was formed in the homes they grew up in, and may even be a reaction to the homes they grow up in. So, it's not about the amount. It's not about the zeros. It's about what's our attitude towards it. And so when we are able to start overcoming whatever resistance may be there, and at least asking the question, do I want to continue the relationship with money that I grew up with? Or do I want to continue the relationship with money that I have today? Either way, it's the critical question of looking at your money and saying, I want to own this relationship. And am I going to own it today differently than I've owned it yesterday and in the past? And then monitor what kind of resistance comes up. What's getting in your way? What are you afraid of? What is the resistance about? What does it mean to shift that? What is it going to mean for you to shift that relationship? And why are you resisting it? What are you afraid of? What anxiety does it bring up? What story do you have about money that is going to continue to keep you in that sort of fiddler crab shell that you grew up with? And what new story might be available so that you can shift that shift that relationship. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I'm going to say, let's get into our resistance around our relationship with money next week in my Tuesday Facebook Live, which I want to say is not going to happen on Tuesday. Tuesday is a religious holiday. I won't be online. But on Wednesday morning, May 19, 9 a.m., I'll be Facebook Live, YouTube Live, LinkedIn Live, talking about the resistance we have when we sit down and look at changing our relationship with money. Thanks for being with me. Check out my website, markcoach.net, my Facebook page, Mark Rothman Progress Coach, my YouTube page. Check out my new videos, Mark Rothman Progress Coach, and I'll see you next week.